I think we're ready.
Okay.
Guys, all right. I think we're all ready to start this talk. Yes. I'm not Zaz, but I am here to introduce him. He comes all the way from a distant land called America. He lived in a small shoe of a house. And, look at the guy. There's a lot I can say about him. He comes often here to BalCCon, from what I hear from him. He's talking about his coming earlier. And the pie. You should ask him about the pie. He's got a really interesting talk today, though. Let's all give him a round of applause to Zaz.
Yeah, but most of that applause should go to Will here for that fabulous intro. Best intro ever. So this talk is about OPSEC with mobile devices in super high threat environments. And so by mobile, I mean I'm going to concentrate on mobile phones, and in particular, as you see here, burner phones. How to use them properly. So there's basically, a couple of different kinds of hacking talks. There's the really deep dive, how does a thing work inside type of talk. There's the ones where you break a system so that you can tell everyone about the problems and help other hackers or help to improve security in general. And there's the type that's about how to commit crimes. And that's what this talk is going to be about. But I don't want people to go out, leave here and say, oh yeah, Zaz encouraged us all to commit crimes at BalCCon. So I'll asterisk that. Crimes in the public interest. So sometimes we have to break the law as a moral imperative, like resisting a repressive system. So, not all laws are good laws. So that's the kind of laws I'm talking about, and the type of crimes. OPSEC stands for Operational Security. Basically means preventing leakage of information that could lead to your discovery or your disadvantage when you're on some sort of a team. And so this is a propaganda image from World War II, sums it up. But of course, in war, we know who our enemies are. We don't have such obvious enemies anymore. It depends who we are and what we're up to. But so it might be a repressive government, might be the police, might be a rival corporation that's engaged in industrial espionage. It doesn't matter. OPSEC is asking, can an adversary exploit or interpret information about what you're doing that can be useful to them, and then preventing that exploitation? So you have to do a red team approach. You have to second guess what you're up to from an attacker's perspective. And especially if what you're up to, what your activities are, put your life at risk or your freedom at risk, then you really have to take this seriously. So you have to do whatever you need to do to motivate yourself. So once again, this talk, maximum threat environments. We're talking about environments populated by highly resourced adversaries, such as state-level observers. Here's another more recent piece of government propaganda. Your tax dollars at work if you're in the United States. But it's pretty straightforward what they're trying to tell you here. You have to look at what information is relevant, look at your likely threats and potential vulnerabilities, and then assess those risks and take appropriate countermeasures. So OPSEC, this is very important, doesn't start and end with the actual operation that you're doing. It needs to cover all of your initial exploration and all of your preparation. In hacking especially, we try a lot of things that don't work the first time. All of those things need to be covered by OPSEC as well, or else you can get busted. And it also extends to what you do after the operation. You can do slip-ups after things have been taken care of, and maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe you're sacrificial at that point, but it's always nice to stay out of prison. You want to take the mindset that you kind of, pretend that you don't know what you're doing beforehand, and afterwards you just forget that you did it. So it's a 24/7 job. So here's a few assumptions going into what I'll talk about today. First of all, the mobile phone network is an amazing machine that humans have built, and it's just very, very convenient. So we're going to assume that it's too convenient not to use entirely. It's fast, easy to access, very widespread. So let's try and figure out a way to use it as safely as possible. We're also going to assume that our conspiracy, our team is comprised of multiple agents, right? If it's just a lone wolf, then we don't need really to use burner phones. We don't have to do a lot of communication. So we're going to talk about teamwork. And we're going to use the mobile phone network in all stages of the operation, planning and execution. If the operation has been pre-planned offline, then just the execution phase is pretty easy to do, relatively speaking, with burner phones. So it's the stuff that happens beforehand that often gets people busted. So here's our goals for our mobile OPSEC plan. We want to communicate with our associates, and we want to also be able to coordinate and execute the operation in real time. And while we're doing that, we want to protect the identities of everyone involved, the locations, especially the ones that are our home base, especially the ones we reside in, the size and the structure of our organization, and then the details of the plan, and ideally the existence of a plan at all. So things like the what, the when, and the where. And here are the constraints that we're operating under with the mobile network. We're going to do this using devices that constantly facilitate the interception of the content and the metadata. They disclose their location all the time without our ability to easily obscure that in a way that we can with the internet, with IP packets. Our devices may host numerous tracking bugs that we're not aware of. And these are just the bare minimum vulnerabilities. It actually gets much, much worse depending on what kind of devices we're talking about. So here's a quick rundown of how much worse it can get. I present to you the smartphone, which is the most fiendish tracking device ever developed by humans. It produces, stores, and therefore can leak, of course, the metadata of all calls and messages straight to the phone companies, and therefore straight to the federal agencies that are in bed with the phone companies. The location information to anyone who can make legal requests of the phone company, which don't need calls to be made, and they also can come from various apps that track location, from metadata that gets attached to photographs, for example. Our contact lists, all the networks that we've ever accessed, unique identifiers of the device and of the SIM card and so on, all kinds of sensor data, which there's some really interesting attacks out there I won't get into here, but there's some great attacks that can extract things from all the accelerometer and gyroscope data, for example, and that's in modern smartphones. Auth cookies, intelligence agencies love these. They can grab those and then they can maintain persistent access to your email accounts and so on. The kind of things you've been searching for. There's no guarantee of strong cryptography on a per app basis on smartphone apps. People screw this up all the time, developers that is. When these are memory constrained devices, so every so often the browser runs out of memory and it reloads all your open tabs, and so that means even if you've accessed something in a secure location, suddenly you can be leaking that information too. Auto-connecting and trying to connect to networks, so anyone who's got Wi-Fi pineapples has played around with this and identified devices based on what networks they connect to. Apps, of course, are totally unreliable in general. And all this stuff add up to a unique pattern of life that can be used to identify you and track you, regardless of whether you swap devices frequently. And so one of my favorite places to go to get OPSEC-related information is the intelligence agencies themselves. The internal communications of those services reveal just how much they like things like phones. So here is some stuff from the Snowden leaks that talk about how great it is when targets use smartphones. So here's a list of all the kinds of things that they can get from in terms of user activity. All the things I just mentioned and more, and this is just an example of sort of a very simple action that most users that use smartphones do all day, every day, sharing a photograph. That's kind of a perfect scenario for the intelligence agencies. They get all kinds of metadata, they get all kinds of information that they can use. But let's quickly cover content, because that seems to many people who are sort of getting into security for the first time, that's what you've really got to protect, right? That's the biggest vulnerability. The thing is with content that it's mostly protected by local laws. So accessing content, depending on the agency, isn't always just a completely straightforward thing. So I'll use the United States as an example because that's what I know well. So in the United States, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, was made in 1978. But in terms of domestic surveillance of content, the appropriate law is CALEA, the Communications Access for Law Enforcement Act from 1994. So that was allowing domestic wiretapping, for example, by the FBI. So by 1999, under CALEA, we got 2.5 million calls being content recorded. So, you know, that's a lot of calls by some metrics, but in terms of the number of calls that are getting made, that's very, very small. There aren't that many content-based wiretaps in the United States. A lot of these come through the phone companies. Another way that the police can do short-range collection is with a device called an IMSI catcher. It's often known by its one particular one's brand name, a Stingray, and what is a cell site simulator. So it tricks any phone in range, it's a short-range device, into connecting through to this fake cell tower instead of the real cell tower. So obviously you can do a man-in-the-middle attack with this device. That's primarily what it's used for. Often also in conjunction with a downgrade attack, so it can trick the phone into using an earlier method of communication with weaker encryption, for example, to make that content capture attack easier. However, in many cases, the uses of these devices have come under scrutiny, and the police, in a lot of cases, prefer not to capture content because capturing content requires a warrant, and in many cases, they can get everything that they need without a warrant by not capturing content, by just capturing metadata. That's in the case of the police. So local law enforcement is usually subject to slightly more restrictions, although in many cases they do not disclose when they use the situations in which they use Stingray-type devices. But the intelligence agencies are in a much better situated position. They can usually just go straight to the phone companies. They have all kinds of agreements in place. And they can also go to each other. So national intelligence agencies often have partnerships. So, for example, the NSA can just say to GCHQ in the UK and say, hey, we're not allowed to domestically surveil this person, but you are. Can you capture their stuff and then just give it to us? Totally legal. That happens all the time. US-Israel partnership as well. They just swap data like that. So they have all these end runs around content legislation. So because if you're at a level at which foreign intelligence is important, like let's say you work for a defense contractor, they'll often say, you are not allowed to discuss any aspect of this project on a phone, under any circumstances. If you want to talk about this project, you have to come to the SCIF, the Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility that we have in our headquarters, and you'll discuss it there with partners and so on. It's because they know that content is a vulnerability when you're talking about espionage, right? When you're talking about stuff that's not constrained by local laws. But in many cases, if you're just a regular criminal, you are going to force the police to get warrants and so on to get content. Now, the other big problem with content is that endpoint security is really bad. So even if wiretaps can't be done by whoever your adversary is, if they can get hold of your actual device, the content that's at rest on that device is often a huge vulnerability. But it's an avoidable vulnerability, right? You can choose whether or not, in many cases, to store content at rest on your device. So that's number one OPSEC rule with mobile devices: don't store content. Here, some more about endpoint security on smartphones. It's just basically a total black box. You can't really know how secure your endpoint is because there's all kinds of ODays out there that you don't know about, the operating system vendor doesn't know about. If they don't know about it, you can't know about it. Recently in the news, I'm sure everyone saw this, that, iOS has a reputation for good security. The iPhone's supposed to be a reasonably secure device, but just announced, by Google Project Zero, a couple of weeks ago, that China had at least 2 years of persistent access to the latest version at the time of iOS and iPhone, right? And they were indiscriminately using this to hack and install malware in a watering hole attack on certain websites. So these were browser ODays with sandbox escapes that you just visited that website. It silently installed an implant on your phone. And 2 years on fully patched most recent devices. And so this was used, we think, against the Uyghur minority. So these were installed on websites that the Chinese government thought that the Uyghur minority people were going to be visiting. And anyone who visited them got owned. Now, when I say you can't know, this particular implant, I really recommend reading Project Zero's deep dive into this. But this particular implant, the ODAs that allowed the implant installation were clever. But the implant itself was completely amateurish. It exfiltrated everything from the device in clear text. So if you were doing any kind of, if you were in a corporate environment and you haven't had an IDS on there that was checking for exfiltration, this would have shown up dramatically, right? They didn't make any effort to make the implant stealthy, really. But what if they did? If the implant was stealthy, you would never know. So here's what the implant exfiltrated. Once it got a foothold, remember I was talking about content at rest and that being a liability. That's exactly what it was exfiltrating. So here is some stuff from Project Zero. All the stored WhatsApp conversations. And let's remember that WhatsApp uses signal encryption, right? So that doesn't save you here because the implant gets everything in clear text. Telegram as well. Same thing, all the conversations. For the full database file for iMessage, that's Apple's proprietary unaudited encrypted messaging system. Who even uses Google Hangouts anymore? I don't know, but the implant exfiltrated it, just in case. Lots more data to grab on smartphones, all the stored email, the contact list, of course, I mentioned, GPS location history, and the keychain. So any passwords that were stored on device, also given up. Also, it's not on the slide, but the OAuth cookies. So this implant allowed the agencies to have persistent email access. The implant didn't survive a reboot of the phone, but the auth cookies were already exfiltrated, so they could still get into people's email. So once again, the implant could have been detected, but you can't count on this. And anyway, even let's say you knew, it's too late. All of that stuff is already in the hands of the attacker. So moving on to metadata, that means all the data. Metadata is data, so all the data the phone generates that is not conversational content. So everything is tagged. Everything you do on the phone is tagged with the endpoint identifiers. So the IMEI, the IMSI, the phone number, all that kind of stuff. So all the calls and messages that get sent. All the temporal data. So what time did you make a call? How long did the call go for? Really, really interesting things can be extracted from that, and I'll go into that more later. Locations, so the cell tower that's being used or IP address of messages being sent over Wi-Fi. The device type, got some interesting stuff on that later too, et cetera, et cetera. But again, this stuff is covered by local laws, so here's the situation in the US. There are things that the police can apply for in order to catch this. So this is, again, police, not intelligence agencies. But the US, the police can request from a judge. I don't think they generally need a warrant for this because it's just metadata. But the two archaic things that date back to the plain old telephone system, number one is called a pen register. So that gives them all numbers that were dialed from a particular phone. So they've got a target phone. They say, okay, I want to know everyone who called this. And then the other is called a trap and trace. That gives you the other way around. That gives you the identifying information of all the phones that call that number. But once we have all that information, we may not care about the content if we're the police. That may tell us exactly everything we need to know about what that phone is being used for. The intelligence agencies, of course, a law unto themselves, they have essentially unlimited ability to capture all of that metadata and store it forever to mine whenever they feel like it. And the bad news for us is that although we can minimize content, we can minimize what we transmit, we cannot avoid producing metadata. And it's not something that we can store, we can delete on the endpoint. That's stuff that's out there, and there's nothing really we can do about that. And so, of course, intelligence agencies are super gung-ho for bulk phone metadata collection. So here's another set of slides from the Snowden leaks showing all of the different types of metadata that they can capture and how excited they are about that. Of course, very famous quote that you've probably heard, Mike Hayden, who was director of the NSA and the CIA, we kill people based on metadata. That's how important metadata is. And here's an example of exactly that. This is when they kill someone with a drone, they produce a little slide deck explaining it. This is part of the internal review process. So here is a slide of a particular drone assassination that was performed. And what I want you to focus on here is that it's not really a person that's being targeted in these drone strikes. It's a phone. So here on the right, it's a little blurry on this screen, but the red stuff is phone SIGINT. And the blue stuff on this graph there, that's where they actually could see the person from the drone. That's where they could see, with the camera and identify that that was the person they wanted to shoot. There's not much blue on that graph. It's almost all tracking a phone, sending a missile to blow up a phone, and whoever's holding it. They just assume that the person holding it is the owner. Identify a phone, track it, bomb it. Location gets extracted by various methods, location metadata. So of course we're pinging a tower. The phone company knows what tower is being pinged, it knows where it's located, and it retains that information for a long time. And that's accessible to anyone who has a partnership with the company. In conflict zones where they're actually droning people, they also use various RF direction finding tools, so they can track phones that are turned on even if they're and if they're broadcasting, even if there's no tower in range. But not everywhere, obviously, is saturated with this type of capability. Then, of course, we know that when we look for our own location with a smartphone, it uses the Wi-Fi neighborhood first to find the location, and then GPS is used as a high resolution. Next thing, the GPS takes power, so it uses the Wi-Fi neighborhood first. Again, it's impossible to avoid producing some sort of location information when the phone is active. So here's an example from when a journalist in Australia decided to voluntarily give up a year of his own phone metadata just to see what could be extracted. So here's the location metadata. So it's pretty obvious where this guy lives and works. And he's commuting every day between those two locations. So just from the tower ping information, and then from the contact information, we can see who he talks to and when. So we can infer some things about who he's dating, who he works for, that kind of stuff. So we get a very accurate pattern of life just from this phone metadata, which I call that an attack surface of life, right? It's not just a pattern, and that's just from a few pieces of metadata that's being collected over the year. So fun times. Here's time for our fun case study number one. This is going to be the CIA, who obviously these guys are experts at this stuff, right? Like OPSEC, it's the middle name of the CIA. They never fuck anything up at the CIA. That's why their history is called Legacy of Ashes. So in this case, a CIA team illegally abducted an Egyptian cleric named Abu Omar off the street in Italy. They grabbed him, took him to Egypt to be tortured. Okay, this guy disappeared. How do we know the CIA did it? Of course, from the phones. There's the picture of the guy. So they get this guy. He's on the street in Italy. They throw him in the CIA van in 2003, February. In April 2004, the Italian prosecutors started looking into this guy's disappearance. They found out that he showed up in Egypt. He was released from detention in Egypt. They're like, okay, how did he get there? In early 2005, they reconstructed a very detailed pattern of this abduction from the phone records. And then in July 2006, they filed charges in Italy against 31 CIA assets, including 26 Americans. And that led to the director of the CIA at that time, Portegas, to be like, oh shit, how did you guys get owned so badly? We need a top-down review of our tradecraft because this was bad. So let's take a look at what happened. Mostly, this was done by metadata mining. They went to the phone companies and said, we want all this historical phone records from the area. And they primarily used the location information. So they looked at phones that were in the same place and that moved to the same place together. So here's Italy with the location of an American airbase. And they found 17 phones in Milan on the street where the guy was abducted, and then also nearby in Cormano. So there were two separate teams that were responsible for this. The Milan team phones moved to Cormano and linked up with team number 2. And then those phones were used to call phones at Alviano Air Base, and then they moved there. So, all right, that's interesting. And then they looked at some flight records to show that they flew to Ramstein in Germany, then they flew to Egypt. And then, oh, look what else showed up in Egypt. The phone of the CIA chief of base from Milan. Connected to cell towers in Egypt, made calls back to Milan. And then the phone went back to Italy 1 month afterwards. Okay, all right, that's like pretty compelling circumstantial evidence that the Americans were involved. Well, what happened next? Well, those phones were also located at luxury hotels in Milan, $500 a night. That's fancy, your tax dollars at work. Those hotel rooms were paid with credit cards with names on them, and hotel stays were connected to frequent flyer membership details to get those points, right? They were also under real names. So these allowed the real identities of the abductors to be discovered. So, end of this case study, the outcome, epic fail on the part of the CIA. 25 agents and 1 Air Force lieutenant colonel were indicted and convicted in absentia in courts in Italy. The CIA base chief got 8 years prison. Of course, they weren't there to serve the prison time, but if they go to Europe, they could be imprisoned. The Rome station chief got 7 years, and the others got 5. Also, 2 Italian secret agents were convicted, not in absentia. The director of SISMI, which was the relevant intelligence agency that was providing support in Italy, got a 10-year prison sentence, and the deputy director got 9. And everyone, pretty much, got slapped with €1.5 million fines. So, serious consequences for this abduction and torture scenario. So, let's take a quick look at a summary of the mistakes that were made. They used a single set of phones. So non-burner type, they used them continuously over the 9-day operation, never took out the batteries. So they have a perfect minute-by-minute history of all of the movement of those phones. They should have destroyed every phone that they used in the operation immediately, before they could give up any location history of what happened next. Even if those phones could have been identified, they should not have been kept around to provide further evidence. Obviously, they should never have been localized at places that were important prior to the operation. Those phones should just have been used for the abduction operation. They certainly should never have been used to contact known assets that could be connected back to them. So they were used to call the US consulate, they were used to call the air base, they were used to call the CIA chief of base, and also Langley, Virginia. What's in Langley, Virginia? The headquarters of the CIA. And of course, friends and family. And what is the CIA chief of base doing traveling with a known phone? Like being tracked around the world based on his phone? That seems to be a basic mistake. All right, so moving on from that case study, one thing that's mentioned there is like, hey, they didn't take the batteries out. Well, some people might say that seems like a paranoid thing to do. Is it really necessary to take the batteries out? Yes, it is. Because inside every phone is a baseband processor chip that is a complete black box. It manages all of the radio functions of the phone, and you cannot know what that fucker is doing in there. It's got its own memory, it's got its own proprietary firmware running on a proprietary real-time operating system, which has never been independently code audited. You just can't know what it's doing. But okay, you may say, well, I'm sure it's okay. I'm sure that they really put a lot of effort into the security of this device and to make sure there's nothing wrong with it. Well, that would be a comforting but false thought, because in 2014, the people working on Replicant, which is a Libre version of Android, did find a backdoor in the baseband processor that's used in the Samsung Galaxy. It allowed full read-write access to user data on the application side. So this processor could get out and get other data on the smartphone and then modify it or read it and transmit it without you having any idea. In 2017, Wyman found a memory corruption vulnerability in a baseband processor that Huawei uses. It was an over-the-air memory corruption vulnerability, so people could just transmit things to you and own the phone. And then in 2013, Carsten Knoll did SIM routing, because there's a little processor on the SIM2 that can communicate with the baseband processor. And then just yesterday, I thank Mr. Gadget for bringing this to my attention half an hour before this presentation. A group found a malware deployment vulnerability that they're calling SimJacker. So they can use an old on-SIM browser. They can send it a binary SMS and then command it to exfiltrate various data, including location data. So I'm looking forward to the full report on this being released. It hasn't been released yet, but they've announced it. And not every SIM is vulnerable, but you just can't know what's going on in there. And you can have this thing return an SMS message with location information, all kinds of other things, and it's completely transparent to the user. The user will never see this happen. So the fact that this processor controls the antenna means that it can expose you just by turning something on, even if it's not exfiltrating any data. If if some intelligence agency has an exploit for this and they just want to fire a missile at you, they can put on a signal and turn it on, no matter what that you think that the phone is doing. There's an interesting project that was done a little while ago on whether you could let a user know what the phone is up to. Because even if you even if you open your phone and put a switch in between the baseband and the antenna, just the wires on the circuit board are enough to leak enough RF that it could exfiltrate data over a short range. And of course, if there's malware on the phone, they can defer payload exfiltration. Like if you think your phone is off and it's collecting data on you, it can just wait for you to turn it back on again, and then it can exfiltrate all that data. So you just can't know. So if you want to really modify the phone to be able to detect this kind of stuff, it requires extreme modifications. So in 2016, Bunny Wang and Edward Snowden worked together, mostly Bunny, to do this thing they call the introspection engine. So this was a little board that was like a parasitic add-on. They did it for a particular model of iPhone. So here it is sitting under the battery of a modified iPhone and sticking out the side. There it is with the screen back on. And there's a breakdown of the way that it's connected. And what it does is it measures and reports to you your cell, GPS, Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth antenna activity in real time. So it tells you, okay, you may think your phone is in airplane mode or Wi-Fi's off or whatever, but here's what it's actually doing. So pretty cool project. Very nice, and that's also worth reading their full report on. But, this, as cool as it is, it's nothing more than a proof of concept, right? No one is ever going to use this as a practical solution because it's very dependent on the model. You have to have a lot of hardware hacking experience to even install it. The reality is that we just accept that we cannot trust the hardware at all. And so we remove the batteries. And that's another reason why most smartphones are evil, because most of them these days do not have removable batteries. Okay, so back again to metadata analysis and what they use to how they can use it against us. Once again, we'll use the intelligence agency's documentation to back this up. So this is from GCHQ in the UK. This is all about identifying social networks from mass-collected contact data. So again, the modus operandi of agencies that have a privileged network position is to collect everything and then mine it. So here's a few of their contact chaining programs, and at least two, probably three, maybe more of these are based on telephony. So Prime Time is a system for doing timing analysis, for looking at what phones are connected to what based on when they do certain things. MOAG is, they mention it being an integrated telephony data mining. We don't actually know what it stands for, but my guess is mother of all, something that starts with G, because of the capitalization of MOAG. And then Sorting Friends is one that the NSA developed that they gave to GCHQ and let them use to do basically figuring out like who the important contacts were. And they're trying to integrate this all into this thing called Chartbreaker. Here's the slide on sorting friends. So it takes advantage of all the metadata that's available. So direct contacts, co-location, timing and sequencing, if you call a number and whether they call back, because that's a way to get rid of numbers, the wrong numbers and things like that, and similar numbers and so on. So here's just a quick breakdown of how that network analysis thing works. So you have this big map, this big graph, and you have nodes, which are phones, and edges, which are contacts between phones. And so first of all, you score those edges based on what type of contact it is. So blue is temporal information, a timing pattern. Black is when a sender contacts a receiver. Red is based on the relationship that's been determined between two recipients, maybe from other metadata or other means. And then green is a score of something called PSOUP, which we also don't know what that stands for. That's some sort of algorithm that is part of a document that was not leaked, so we don't know what that is. Then, once you've got these edge scores, you score the nodes based on the weights relative to what you know about the target. And of course, how you do that weighting, anytime you have some kind of weighted network analysis algorithm, generating the weights, that's the big question. So we don't know how they do that, and in their slides they also say like that's something we're still working on. But that's the basic process. But all of this stuff assumes they already know to look for you, right? You're already a target. They're looking at what you're up to. But they're also really interested in figuring out likely targets. This is kind of what they call the discovery program, and the agencies really sweat over this because if something happens and they didn't know anything about it, right? Some guys go and they bomb the London subway or something. Everyone says to them, "You fuckers, why didn't you warn us this was going to happen?" It's because they had no idea. So they really want to figure out in advance when there are networks of people that are up to no good from their mass collection data. That's the resource they want to use. So target discovery from the social graph. So this is in particular looking for burner phone teams. Right? This is the classic adversarial approach to burner teams. So defining them by temporal usage, usually used around the same time and also activated and deactivated at the same time, and the network characteristics, so closed loops, not calling anyone else, and this is the interesting part that I alluded to earlier, by the handset type. So critical features here, they all start life at the same time, and the phones are cheap handsets. Right? Because everyone's got a budget, right? If you're going to use burner phones, you might as well go cheap. That's the theory. And then also pointing out here that you can't just look for phones that never call outside the loop because people dial wrong numbers or they order a pizza or whatever, right? You can't count on the fact that network's going to be completely self-contained. So here's the basic process. Things that are important here. The time window, that's short for various reasons, but one of the main reasons is because that screens out the accidental connections to the main network. So they say here, large enough to allow the giant component. So the giant component is the big blob of normies, right? They're all the people you don't care about. And you just want to find these small groups. But you don't want to make your window large enough that an accident means that the group goes under the radar. So what they tested on here, 1.6 million phones. They got that data, most probably straight from the phone companies. Then you see here, they got 4,000-ish phones that weren't in the giant component, weren't in the blob, and they were otherwise, somewhat interesting, and that was winnowed down to 17 interesting active loops. So out of 1.6 million phones, they've got 17 small groups that were of further interest. Because, it's not hard to think of closed loops that they might not be interested in, right? Like, so you've got some elderly relative that's got a phone just to call, the grandkids or something like that, right? Like, they don't care about that. So there we go, the closed loop. The sign of the pentagram. Once again, the device type, we often don't think that that's useful to anyone, but it can be useful because burners are likely to be cheap. And these good old Nokia candy bars. That's what I used to use at DEF CON. And the flip phones. They're coming back though. They're going to be like retro popular soon. The problem of a dumb phone standing out is only going to get worse, right? Smartphone penetration, at least in wealthy countries, is like getting very close to 100%. So, you got to keep that in mind when you're planning your operation. That the dumb phone is likely to make you stand out, but you kind of have to use it. But so you should be a little bit diverse about which phones you use. So you need like a fair bit of effort to avoid standing out in a closed loop with your operation. You need to do what I call active OPSEC. You need to make a plan and execute that plan. So here's some more stuff that's not slide documents. This is from actual documents you can read, which is cool. I like those, about how they use metadata to identify targets with little info other than the network graph mining. One takeaway from this sort of recapitulates what we just said, but the fact that they say the interest in closed loops is very sensitive. Even though it's kind of an obvious thing that you would do, they don't want you to know that they're doing it. So if you're going to falsify your metadata, it's going to take care and planning. So you've got to think about what that graph looks like. Think about the time window, right? You can't just like call a few numbers once and you're done. You have to do it every so often. So think about how an adversary could filter out your deliberate noise. You're putting noise in the signal. They want the signal. How could they filter it? One particular way is when you are using. So what you should do, obviously, is with your burner, is you should call nodes to get you want to be in that big blob. You want to be in the giant component. But you can't just call what they call pizza nodes, right? So pizza nodes are numbers that everyone calls because it's like the pizza shop. Everyone in the neighborhood calls the pizza shop to order a pizza. So when you're falsifying your call network, you can't use pizza nodes because they're already screening those out as part of the closed loop detection. So what's that? Yeah, Cevapi nodes. That's what they would be in Serbia. The Cevapi nodes, the index sandwich nodes. But you don't call index sandwich. You go there and get one. And then also the temporal information is really important. So a lot of this metadata analysis boils down to timing, right? So your closed loops are only if they're your operational execution burner phone network, they're only going to be active for a short period of time while you do the op. So there's that temporal thing. An interesting and funny thing here in the GCHQ documents, they say, well, we can identify our own agents because they're not allowed to bring their phone into work. So their phones are always dead from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. So they can identify spies because their phones are active during the day. No one else's phones are inactive during the day. So that's kind of funny. So you got to pay attention to timing correlation. You got to pay attention to latency because they have all this callback stuff too. So if you call a number and they call you right back straight away, that proves to them that was a real contact. So you can introduce some latency. You can randomize that, but to add this noise to the causal chain of events that could be being mined. But again, all of this takes a lot of effort. You've got to really think about it. So time for another case study, and this time people who really thought about it, but they still fucked it up. So Hezbollah, also operational security experts. They're very good at what they do. This guy is Rafik Hariri. He was the former prime minister of Lebanon who had just resigned in 2004. His net worth was $16 billion when he resigned from office. So definitely a corrupt motherfucker, right? Like if you're a politician and you leave office with $16 billion, you probably deserve what happened to this guy, which was that Hezbollah blew him up with a giant car bomb. Unfortunately, the 22 other people that got killed by that car bomb mostly probably didn't deserve it. Anyway, this assassination, which took place after he resigned from office, interestingly, was pinned on Hezbollah, even though someone called up and took responsibility for it who was not Hezbollah. A guy, sent in a jihad video saying, like, I'm a member of some, obscure, violent political organization. I did the bombing. Here's my video and everything like that. I think I said that. But nevertheless, it was pinned on Hezbollah. Well, how do you think they figured that? You guessed it, phones. So let's take a quick look at how it went down. Here's a map of Beirut. Here's Hariri leaving his home. High security, 6-car motorcade, bulletproof vehicles and everything. The truck bomb started down here. So Hariri goes to Parliament earlier in the day, and the bomber starts going too. So it was clocked going through a tunnel so they could see the phone signal be inactive in the tunnel. But then the Prime Minister stops at a cafe. And the bomber somehow knew about that, and he pulls over and waits. Then later on, they both go to the hotel, and the bomb detonates. Kaboom. So let's have a look at what happened. A guy who worked for the security services in Beirut is the one who started off putting all this together. So February 2005, the assassination. First of all, they started to look at the full, they went to the phone companies, they got all the records, as you do, and they looked at co-location and interconnection, right? Very similar things like with the CIA example. And they identified a few different groups of phones that were most likely involved. So one group, 3 phones, they called the Green Group. These were purchased a long time before the operation, relatively speaking, almost a year beforehand, with fake IDs. Good work. They were paid for in cash, also good. And a lot of minutes were put on these phones, like $7,500 or $7 3/8,000 goes a long way in Lebanon on phone minutes. So these phones were used a lot. So these were the leadership communications phones for the conspiracy. Then we had the Blue Group, 18 phones. These were acquired very early on, from 2003. Once again, fake IDs paid in cash. And they were geolocated around Hariri constantly from about October 2004. So these guys were following him around, and they were taking notes of everything that he did. They were also co-located with the purchase of the truck. The truck was purchased out of town, again, paid in cash. And some guys just showed up and like, yeah, this truck looks pretty good. The truck itself actually was stolen and was being sold. So it was like there was a totally different criminal network involved. Now, here's a great fuck up here. So after the operation, these were disposed of by a Hezbollah technician, but he used one of them to call his girlfriend. Facepalm, yeah. So that was one of the things that really cemented the Hezbollah connection here. There was also the Yellow Group, similar size. Yellow Group and Blue Group kind of, one took over from the other. The Yellow Group did also surveillance of Hariri, and they also did a lot of scouting of the site where they were going to plan to detonate the bomb. Then there was the Purple Group. The Purple Group, small group, only 3 phones. This was what the cover team used. They used it to recruit the guy who pretended to be the suicide bomber on the video. And they were located at a mosque where they recruited this guy, which, by the way, I forgot to mention, the reason they know he wasn't the guy who blew up the truck is they found shreds of the truck bomber and did DNA analysis, and it wasn't the same guy. So they knew that this was a fake cover story. And then these ones were the ones that were present when payphones were used to call the media, to call Al Jazeera and pretend, hey, I'm some dude from some other random jihad group, and I blew up the former prime minister. Then there was the Red Group, 8 phones. This was a set of phones that were activated in January 2005 in a decoy location. So Hezbollah owns a certain part of Beirut. Like there's like a Hezbollah area. So these ones were all activated somewhere else. So, again, to try and like draw attention away from Hezbollah. 2 minutes before the bombing, these phones were turned off, were never switched on again. They were also only ever recharged in a decoy location. So these phones were only ever powered on in a location that didn't look like it was involved with Hezbollah. So this was the operational team. That was the one that was being used just for the bombing. And another interesting detail, you can go to these documents from the criminal court. They did a trial run, or maybe they attempted an operational run a short time beforehand, and for whatever reason they didn't go through with the final bombing. So they could see all this from the metadata, that this operational team had a go at it, either as practice or as an aborted attempt. So what happened? What's the outcome here? 5 Hezbollah members, again in absentia, brought to an international court. This guy, Onesi, was a member of the Purple Group, so he's the guy who recruited the fake suicide bomber. Sabra, also in the Purple Group, he's the one who called Al Jazeera to deliver the fake jihad video, which he hung in a bag on a tree and he said, go check this tree. Like, can you imagine being part of the media, and so you get a phone call and the guy's like, there's a thing hanging from a tree, and if you don't pick it up in 15 minutes, you'll never see it, and it's like, and we just blew up the prime minister. You'd be like, holy shit. Anyway. Merhi, also in the Purple Group, so we're seeing a bit of a theme here. It's the Purple Group who mostly getting busted here. This guy fucked it up. When he filed his income tax return, he had the Purple phone and his personal phone on together in the same place, so the government knew. And he also accidentally used his Purple phone to order furniture and then called to complain when it wasn't delivered. And it was co-located with one of the green phones. So this guy was also part of the leadership conspiracy. Ayash was leader of the red group. He actually had 11 phones, 2 landlines, 5 personal phones, 4 operational phones, including a green phone. Carried them all together. So made the mistake of co-location. And then Badruddin was the leader of the green group. He had 13 phones. They were frequently co-located, but they never called each other. He had some operational phones that he would destroy and then activate a new one, but because of that sequential destruction activation, they could tell that he was passing on one operation phone onto the other. He was a little difficult to pack down because he had 2 separate identities, and he had a whole bunch of mistresses, and so he's calling his mistresses with a bunch of these phones and everything. So complicated to unpick that. But he was the pizza node of the green group. So he's the one, they would all call him, and then he would call the other person. So he was the guy, the person in the middle there of the green group. And when the green phones were deactivated, his was the last one to get a call. So they started this trial in 2014. It's still in progress. Nothing's definitive has happened except for the fact that Badruddin got assassinated in Syria in 2016. So his part of the case is dead. But the other guys are still... there's still a case, and their representatives are saying it's all circumstantial, blah, blah, blah. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, because it is, in a way, circumstantial. So let's see, what were the successes of this case study? So, well, they purchased their phones early, right? So they didn't temporally correlate their phone purchases with the operation. That's great. They didn't leave a paper trail. They used cash. They also purchased them in other places, and they took care in where they bought them, where they activated them. Didn't do it in the Hezbollah district. They had their teams pretty effectively compartmentalized, with the exception of the purple-green overlap, because one of the green guys has to be on the purple team. But they did a good job. So the blue and yellow team, no idea, right? No one knows. They destroyed the phones after the operation. That was good. That's what you have to do. And then they did a lot of content protection. So all of this stuff is metadata analysis. They didn't allow any phones to be captured and recover content. They kept all their communications, as far as we know, in code, just like the old school mafia. But there were some failures, obviously, because we know about it. So they co-located with their personal phones. So that allowed the location-based data mining. They co-located with the truck purchase, right? They should have not brought the phones with them when they went to buy the truck. The accidental use of the operational phone for the personal purchase. The fact that the networks were closed allowed them to be categorized as which group was what. Okay, not necessarily a problem. It's not necessarily a problem to know that the red phones are the operational team, but the semi-closed networks sort of allowed the hierarchy of the conspiracy to be uncovered. And of course, the disposal technician fucking it up to call his girlfriend very bad. And then that sequential use of operational phones. You need to overlap. If you're going to switch out phones, they should be temporally overlapped, because the sequence can stand out. So after all of this, you might be thinking, fuck, this sucks. There's just no way we can do it. Like, I know you said it's too convenient not to use, but we should just go phoneless, at least for some parts of our operation. But that has implications too. It can introduce its own set of problems. So, for example, the ability to have flexibility, right? No plan survives first contact with the enemy. So not being able to change plans on the fly is also an OPSEC problem, all right? So we need to communicate on our teams somehow. Maybe it's not with a phone. So what else could we use? Well, we could use radios, right? And that, in fact, the guy who figured out all the Hezbollah metadata stuff from the Lebanese security services, Hezbollah assassinated him later with a bomb, and they didn't fuck it up that time. They didn't use any phones during the operation. They used they used radios. So they learned. Of course, if you use radios, you've got range issues. If you point to point, you've got the range of the handset. Otherwise, you've got to set up a repeater. Encryption is a pain on radios. You can do it, but it's like, you know, there's not a lot of good turnkey solutions unless you have access to military equipment. And then you've got to manage keys too. Like if you're doing your own point-to-point encryption, then everyone's got to have the right keys. You've got to distribute those, and you've got to make sure they don't fall into the wrong hands. And of course, anything that's transmitting is subject to radio frequency direction finding, but that's something that has to be in place, right? It's not like metadata where they can go after the fact and just get it from the phone companies. Now, I used to advise people, what about just using a Wi-Fi only mobile device and hardened messaging apps, right? Something like the iPod Touch, which I used to be a big fan of. You've got to deal with the fact that sometimes you don't have Wi-Fi, and so the reliability of access, and you've got to make sure you have your ComSec in place with open, if you're going to use the Starbucks Wi-Fi or anything, just like don't fuck that up. But there are other OPSEC implications, such as IP geolocation. You can deal with that stuff. But the big one, the reason why I hesitate to recommend this, is the endpoint security is just as bad, right? Those iOS 0 days that the Chinese government is deploying against iPhones, they also work against iPod Touches, and they also work against, whatever your other, there are also bugs available for other smartphone-like devices that aren't smartphones. So, that's a longer story than we can cover in this presentation, but just be aware of it. And then also, not having a phone on you these days, people say, oh, what's wrong with you, right? That can appear suspicious. Although that's a little bit counterbalanced by if you normally have one and you're creating a pattern of normal life and the phone doesn't move, as long as you don't get caught without it, you also haven't moved, right? So that's, you can sort of falsify your metadata that way. So on that note, case study number 3, what the Chinese government is up to right now. They are, surveilling the shit out of their population, starting off with the Uyghurs, who I mentioned earlier. And they have a social surveillance system that's been made for the government by Chinese contractors called IJOP, the Integrated Joint Operations Platform, which is basically an app-based sensor network. It takes in manually inputted information from police at checkpoints, and then also tied into face recognition systems, which are everywhere in China now, and these checkpoints that you see up on the screen here, that are more prominent in areas like Xinjiang and like Tibet, but they're more or less all over the place. So this IJOP app, or at least the phone app part of it, so this is a thing that all the police have on their phones, was reverse engineered by Human Rights Watch and a security group from Germany called Q53 late last year, early this year. And so this thing basically is designed to slurp up a lot of information and track people's activities and flag their anomalous behavior. In particular, their phone use. So the communications they're doing, their web browsing, the kinds of software that are installed. The phone, of course, is if the things that are red flags, like this makes you look like a person of interest, is if the phone shows up at a location that's outside where your normal activity should be. So here's a screenshot that's been translated from Chinese into English, showing the things that can be. And so one of the things there is reason for no trajectory information, like why hasn't your phone been used? If you use a phone that's not registered to you, that's a red flag. If you're registered to a phone that's disappeared, that's a red flag. If you've changed phone numbers recently or someone you're related to has changed them, used smartphones in the past but has stopped together or are using only analog phones. That's a direct translation of the Chinese in the app. So what this all adds up to is that in a repressive state like China, the phone is now a personal ID. It's like your driver's license or your passport, except it's also got real-time tracking capability. So that's sort of a whole new level of OPSEC required. Very, very difficult, right? If you can avoid checkpoints, then you might be able to move around, just like you can get around without your driver's license if you're not driving, if you don't get pulled over by the police, and you can go within a country without your passport, in most countries anyway. So you can, if you can travel without your phone and not get questioned by the police, maybe that's okay. But that's really hard for the Uyghurs because they're being racially profiled. So the Chinese government is developing facial recognition systems that also have demographic group recognition capability. Like, you look like a Uyghur, we're going to pull you in and check your phone and stuff like that. So that's just a very difficult situation. There's probably not too many OPSEC tips that I can give for people who are under that kind of level of surveillance. But so here is the summary advice that I can give for using burner phones for your operational needs. Here's all the do's first. Purchase them in advance. So, and be careful where you purchase them, because people have been caught from the surveillance videos. Like, they go to a Walmart or whatever, and they pull the surveillance video. That surveillance video usually gets rolled over after some time. So that's just another reason to purchase things far in advance. And of course, pay cash. When you register your phones, do it far away from your operational area, because geolocation of those phones starts as soon as you turn them on and activate them. And don't register all your group's burner phones at the same time and in the same place. Of course, tell lies to the phone companies. Those bastards don't deserve anything better. Dumb phones are better than smartphones for the most part. Again, knowing that the cheapest possible dumb phones may stand out in a wealthy country. But basically, the smartphone's attack surface and data leakage just isn't worth the risk. If you've got a serious operation that you're going to get seriously fucked if you get caught, it's just not worth the risk. Don't be all the same type. And if you want to go the secure messaging route, you can use other internet devices that aren't phones. Definitely remove the battery. It's the only way that you can trust the baseband processor if it doesn't have power. Fill your phones with fake contacts. Anything, don't put real contacts in there, obviously, but fake ones are good too, because they can be leaked. And if you get searched and you've got a phone with no contacts in it, that can also look suspicious. Then, use your operational phones only as needed, including doing your periodic metadata faking. And remember that creating plausible, misleading metadata is more difficult than not creating metadata at all. You pull the battery out, you're not creating metadata, but making a plausible fake story is hard. It takes thought. So make a plan and stick to it. When you switch locations, also switch phones. One of the easiest ways to not fuck up the location switching part is to just leave phones in their operational locations and pick them up when you get there. And then that minimizes the risk that you'll do accidental cross-disclosure. Falsify your call network. So call unrelated numbers within realistic window periods to thwart graph analysis techniques, and avoid pizza nodes when you're exiting your closed loops. And then, obviously, don't have your group all use the same false numbers. A lot of these things seem obvious, but even the CIA fucks it up. Security through obscurity actually can totally help, right? Like, we in InfoSec and Hacker Conference stuff, we always like to sort of make fun of security by obscurity, but security obscurity does help as long as you pay attention to the obscurity part, right? So learn from the mafia, who were masters at this, right? They beat a lot of indictments because they just talked what seemed to be gibberish. Their phones were tapped, but no one could tell what they were talking about because everyone had a nickname. Everyone had the stuff, all the scams they were running all had like operational code names and stuff. Or if you don't want to feel like you're, emulating the mafia, then you can emulate the famous Navajo code talkers in World War II, which is exactly the same thing, right? The Japanese were intercepting transmissions, and so the US wanted a group that, even if their transmissions were intercepted, the Japanese would never figure it out, so they got Native American, Navajo, native language speakers to talk about, they had code words, like a tank was the Navajo word for a turtle or something like that. The Japanese never figured it out. So all that kind of code, that really helps if, or I should say when, one of your endpoints gets compromised, or one of someone gets subject to a wiretap. Remember what each phone is for, and only use it for that purpose. And thou shalt always kill. When you retire a phone, dispose of it properly. Make sure it's never, ever used again. And then here are the don'ts. So obviously don't co-localize. Don't allow a phone to be on in a location that you can be personally placed at. And don't allow a phone to be on at the same time and place as another phone that you're using, whether it's an operational phone or not. Don't activate phones in the same time or place. And don't call other related phones from your burner phone, because that's going to bring them into your burner network. And don't call unrelated phones from different burners, because that correlates them together. Don't store real data. Endpoints are definitely the weakest link. Don't neglect the fact that people, through no real fault of their own, lose phones, or they get stolen, or they get confiscated, by the police or whoever. Like these kind of accidents happen, and your operation should be robust to these kinds of accidents. And don't temporally correlate last use and first use when you switch burners. That really stands out. And then don't use online services that can produce metadata that can connect subnetworks, right? So don't check your Gmail with your burner phone. Don't buy furniture with your burner phone if you're on the Hezbollah operational team. And then when you refill them, do it as anonymously as possible. It's getting harder in modern society. Cash is going away, but you can still, in many cases, buy these anonymous prepaid cards and use them. So here's my final advice. Just be careful. Be intelligent about what you're doing. It's really, really hard, right? Anonymity is hard. Like, talk to any of the Tor people about how hard they work to make anonymity work on the internet. It's very, very difficult, and it's only getting worse as everything gets more connected and as storage gets cheaper. Or, if you live in China, it's getting pretty close to impossible. So, it's hard, but it's worth your effort. If your life is at stake, if your freedom is at stake, then take it seriously. I don't want to see anyone in this room in prison or hit by a drone strike. I love you all. OPSEC is a 24/7 job. Of course, you got to decide on your threat model. Maybe you don't care about nation-state intelligence agencies, but plan and act according to it. And then red team your own plan. Think about it. Like, if you were given a massive database of location, time, call destination, call length, metadata, what would you do with it? This stuff is kind of predictable, actually. Or a privileged view of the network. If you can think of it, you can guarantee that some person at GCHQ or NSA is getting paid to work on this. And follow the OPSEC guide. Do what makes sense for you to resist massive surveillance. I think massive surveillance is bad. I think it's our duty to resist it. But do it in a way that makes sense for you. If you're a Uyghur in China, it's very different than if you're a Hezbollah member, or if you're a animal rights activist group, which have been targeted by the FBI in the United States. There's lots of reasons why you might be, not committing bad crimes, but you still want to make use of this information. So that's my advice. Good luck to you all. I totally, maybe I didn't run over time because I started 15 minutes after. So anyway, but we've got time for questions. I don't think anything's really scheduled except for hacker karaoke is coming up next.
I have something interesting to add, I guess. I had about a year ago a phone call from my credit card company that they blocked a fraud transaction, which was correct. And I managed to get that person into a talk for the next hour how they work. And they worked, I mean, ultimately credit card companies are the same as every spy agency because they want to prevent fraud. So you can communicate with them. I did once when I wanted to do a transaction on my prepaid card to book 2 individual things. I did 2 transactions to my credit card to tell them, yes, this is intentional. And they were like, yeah, when we actually saw that. And that's why it went through, because I expected it to fail. And also they know, because I fly with Air Serbia or with my domestic carrier over here to Serbia, they told me, this indirectly tells you, if you want to go to a place and you don't want to track, don't use the national carrier and pay with your credit card. Use some other carrier.
Yeah, that's something actually I've talked to people who work in the credit card industry too, and they're very upfront about the fact that they use plane ticket destinations to figure out whether or not purchases are real or not in their fraud detection unit. So there's some data that they're legally not supposed to mine, but that they are completely upfront about the fact that they mine air ticket information on your credit card.
They're really good.
Okay, so you've convinced me. I'm gonna get a bunch of burner phones. Do I drive to a location to pick these up? Do I take a plane and make a connection and then end up in a city, but on my connection, do I pick up the phones? How do I get these? Because I feel like if I drive, I'm gonna get tolls. If I fly, they're gonna log me. What do I do? I'm paranoid now.
Yeah, you know, the tracking problem is getting worse, and it depends on the individual country, but public transport is good. There's a lot of camera surveillance on public transport, but they have rolling buffers. So again, advanced purchases will help you on public transport. Certainly avoid tolls. There's very little information on retention for, at least in the United States, for automated license plate recognition systems. There's very little legislation related to them, and the police are very cagey about anything involving them, so retention and stuff like that. And now they have mobile units too, so even avoiding tolls doesn't help you, because police cars drive around with these ALPR systems and they just capture. Some local areas, like in California, they've made some laws now on retention, but the law enforcement love them, and so they're very cagey about what they do with them. But yeah, you know, you're an athlete, so you should run to the store and buy your phones.
Side note, from an OPSEC perspective, you can buy cash for Interrail tickets. You can buy them for up to 3 months. And even if it says you have to show your passport, I've had to show it twice in the last 2 months.
Yeah, also I think it's pretty much not illegal to show fake IDs to people who aren't working for the government or law enforcement. Like I personally would totally feel fine about showing fake ID to the train clerk.
Thanks for the talk, Sos. Do you have any recommendations for people who intend to go to the United States? Because, you know, I do intend to go there. I don't want to have my personal phone searched, but I figure that buying a burner phone will make them very suspicious.
Actually, I do have some advice about that. I'm glad that you mentioned that. So there was a case that just came up in the last couple of weeks where a freshman at Harvard was coming to the United States to start the year, because the academic year in the United States starts in September. And he had a visa, and he got to the airport in the United States, and they asked him to unlock his phone and his laptop, which he did. And they went through everything on the devices, and they read people that he was following on social media had written some bad things about the United States. So, you know, who knows what it was, like bad, right? Like they just said, fuck Trump or whatever, I don't know. But so they canceled they didn't like what they saw, even though he hadn't retweeted that and he hadn't written it himself, and they canceled his visa and sent him away. So I think there's some pretty good lessons in that, which is if you think that you are of interest, just don't bring anything with you that you're going to get in that situation. They're going to they can ask you to unlock your devices. If you're on a visa and you say no, they totally can just send you home, right? So it's best to have something that you can unlock for them and for what's on that phone to look innocuous. I don't think at this point that a dumb or feature phone will put you on any radar. But given the fact that Trump has been very upfront about a Muslim ban, right? This guy coming from Palestine to go to Harvard, I think should have known better. That's a little bit of a callous thing to say, but if I was him, I would have mailed my devices in an encrypted state to myself at Harvard and then traveled without them or traveled with an innocuous feature phone because the US border is a kind of a lawless state right now. They have taken, the fact that they can search your bags, they've taken to mean all your devices too. If you're a citizen, they can confiscate the devices, but they can't stop you from entering the country. But if you're a non-citizen, they can just say, fuck you, you're on the next plane out of here. So again, if your threat model includes being searched at the US border as a non-citizen, then I would not take a device that I was not prepared to unlock and have inspected.
You mentioned during your presentation that for burner phones or even regular phones, you should remove battery from them. I've heard similar stories from people who know guys in our security service. Has there ever been proven at least one type of phone that when the battery is still in, you switch it off, but it can still do things? Has it been proven?
Well, it's certainly true of phones without removable batteries. They're always on. When you press the on button, there's a processor that's in a low power mode that's monitoring that switch, and it's certainly known that the device is active in some way. And so once you have that knowledge, you can never guarantee that it's not doing anything. So I don't have a specific example of a specific device that was like quote unquote turned off, but still transmitting. So I'm not aware of a verified example of that.
As the proof of concept that Snowden was doing, they were trying to figure out. The Snowden proof of concept, they were measuring the activity, right, of antenna and certain parts of the phone. Yeah. Have they actually proven?
Yeah, they didn't have a device that was doing a known bad thing. It was more of a what-if proof of concept, because you also can't know all possible malwares, right? Once malware is installed on a device, it can do very different things from what a stock patched non-malware infected device can do. So you could totally write a proof of concept. If you root a phone, you can write some software that makes the phone do whatever you want it to. So it's certainly true that it's possible. Whether or not such malware has been discovered in the wild, I don't know. But if it's possible, and if your life is at stake, you should defend against it.
A little related, in phones that you can't remove the battery, how do you feel about using Faraday cages?
I think it's okay, but you should test it. People. I think there's some examples out there where you can see like people have stuck the phone in the microwave or whatever, and then they've like measured it and. Spoiler alert, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It depends on the cage. And there's actually a whole group of people that are interested in this for completely different reasons. They're the Doomsday Preppers, and they do EMP protection. So they bury radios and stuff underground in case there's a nuclear war and the electronics all gets fried. And they have documentation on like how deeply you have to bury things to verify that it won't get destroyed.
Thank you. I would also like to emphasize that's not so much only about being a criminal person doing something wrong. It's also, I've been in Istanbul, for example, and Istanbul really changed radically. And also, if you look at Germany, it was the police who are actually giving information, private information, to right-wing people, and I think it's more like digital self-defense, not planning doing something wrong. It's really something we need to somehow to be able to protect ourselves.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I hope that, you know, I was partly being flippant and trying to amuse people with the whole committing crimes thing. I also very, very strongly agree with what you're saying. But I will say that the amount of cognitive load that it takes to do this level of OPSEC is extremely high. And it's not really maintainable, I think, for people who are just trying to live their normal lives and don't want their information to be possibly used against them by rogue security services. It's not really reasonable to ask people to do that. You know, people have valid personal reasons why they want to carry phones and use them normally. So it's also really important from a privacy standpoint that we have you know, good legislation in place and accountability of the security services. And that's something we just have to work on politically. And I think Germany's at the forefront of that in some ways because they had the experience, you know, of the Stasi and so on, and they remember what it was like. So, you know, that being politically active on this front is really important.
Okay, so a bit different question now. You went through the Hezbollah detailed plan and all the hierarchy, all the details that were put into it, and you had people fairly anonymous involved in that, let's say anonymous to the security services or whoever. And then you got the situation where head of state is tweeting a fairly sensitive satellite photo of the launch site, revealing way too much. So if, let's say, if organizations like Hezbollah working in, let's say, a lower technology level environments are paying so much attention, and this is a person that is very surrounded with people that are aware even more than we are here of the possible threats, and does that, how much is that really ignorance or just don't care? I was just wondering because it seems impossible to me that it's just ignorance or...
Yeah, it's really hard to know, you know. I mean, that situation is just crazy, and it's like, it's sort of interesting, bigger conversation about like how must the intelligence agencies feel when they're like that they're assigned to protect this guy, and he's just like completely crazy. Or like, you know, imagine what kinds of malware are on that phone. You know, like they told him not to use his own phone, and he said, no, I'm going to use my own phone. So like, you know, every intelligence agency in the world must be trying to get an implant on that phone. You know, how many times have they been successful? Who knows?
Any more questions?
Thanks for the talk. I would like to share my experience with the American customs since we a little bit touched this theme. I was traveling to USA in 2002, just 1 year after the 9/11. And I think they were at the peak of their paranoia at that moment, I suppose. And I was traveling from Serbia to America, and something interesting happened. My luggage didn't come on my flight somehow. I managed to pass the guy who checked my passport, but now after that I come to the customs. And I'm coming to them and saying, my luggage is lost, I don't have anything. And they say, go over there and fill the form. I filled it, and out of the... They didn't touch me, they didn't do anything. I don't know what happened actually.
It's too. So when I've come back into the country, my luggage and this luggage to on. Right. They have a difficult coming into the country, and they just don't look. There are times been questions on particular question, right? I think they probably use information. Chances are pretty good to get it in.
Yeah.
Their own, so drugs really have dogs in airports. Is the quarantine important for us to people then bring drugs in? It's just a the third one of these that I've seen, they have dogs trained to sniff for money. So they don't care about drugs or food as much as they care about bricks of U.S. cash. So, you know, it depends on the nation's threat model too.
Yeah. So you mentioned about mailing your own phone to yourself. With a Pakistani guy, or what was it?
The Palestinian, yeah.
Palestinian, yeah. So, how much can they search the postal packages?
They can search it a lot. I mean, but they also there's a lot of mail, so it's difficult. So you know, most of the way that personal quantities of drugs come into the United States is through the mail system, U.S. mail and FedEx. U.S. mail is an interesting case because it's federally protected as private, so they're not allowed to open it without filing warrants and stuff like that, but they're allowed to x-ray it. So suspect packages tend to get x-rayed, but lots of packages come into the country all the time, and a lot of them have electronics or whatever in them, and it's just like, you know, it's just relatively easy to smuggle things in the mail if it doesn't look overtly suspicious. A phone in a FedEx package is not going to look suspicious because, I mean, like or a laptop. Like if you order a laptop from Apple online, that's how it comes to you. It comes in a box from China. So, you know, your chances are pretty good that it'll get through. And Bruce Schneier's done some writing on the border problem too. Like if you want to carry your laptop, but you don't want to be forced to have it searched, you know, his suggestion is you encrypt it with a key that you don't know, and then you mail the key to yourself in the destination country. And then at the border, they say unlock your device, and you say I can't. And then they'll confiscate the device, but you know. But
they have to give it back, right?
But that works, you know, if you're a citizen. But you know, if you're someone who you think they're gonna look askance at you, right? Like especially in America right now as a Muslim, because they have this quote-unquote Muslim ban, and you say, oh, I've got this laptop, but I don't know how to unlock it, they're probably just going to say, fuck you, like, because they have a complete license to fuck with you. There's a great story on The Intercept. I recommend reading it from earlier this year, where an American citizen journalist was in Mexico, and he came back, and the customs guy said, what story were you working on? And he's a journalist, and he's like, I don't have to tell you what story I'm working on. So he just said, look, I was just like evaluating the guacamole at restaurants in Mexico. And the customs agent was just like, oh, you think you're funny? All right, I'm going to keep you here all day. I'm going to make you unlock your devices. And he went through absolutely everything on this guy's devices for an entire day, read every single email, every single text message, looked at every photo on his computer, because he can, you know? So, there's like various ways that you can like make your device not get unlocked, you know, and you can sort of say, well, like the rules are on my side, but the rules are way more on their side if they can stop you coming in the country. If you're a citizen, it's fine, but if you're not, they can just put you on a plane for any reason that they want to. So the best thing to do is not stand out. And so if you think you might get targeted, if you've mailed your phone, if it's encrypted, it doesn't matter really if it gets intercepted on the way. You can, if you want, be super paranoid, and you can paint glitter polish on the seams and detect if it's been opened. You know, all that kind of stuff. But most likely, it's going to get through in the mail just fine, unless you're already someone that's on like a foreign intelligence watch list. And then you've got some just stupid phone at the border that you can unlock for them. It's probably going to be fine.
I'm sorry, but we don't have any more time for questions.
I'm here all weekend, so we can shoot the shit over beers whenever we want to.
Thank you, Zoz.